Good day, denizens. Welcome, willkommen, auf Deutsch. Sorry, to Europe. And we're talking about Europe in the Middle Ages after the fall of Rome and the deluge of the Roman Empire, where basically Europe falls into what some historians call the Dark Ages. Other historians disagree and they get in these arguments, but if they didn't, we wouldn't have history. So arguments are good. I don't know. Anyway, so let's talk some Europe during the Middle Ages, roughly the 500s to really about the 13 or 1400s, even though it says 1500 there. I just do that to confuse you. So a couple of objectives here are what we want to accomplish in this first half. We're broken into two parts. You'll see part two after the Vikings. So why was Western Europe a frontier land? What do we mean by a frontier? We'll talk about that. How did the Germanic kingdoms, basically it's going to be these German, what the Greeks would have called barbarians, who are going to come to dominate Europe. And one guy in particular, Charlemagne, who is going to lay the foundations for the countries that we see in Europe today. And then finally we'll talk about the Vikings. They were real nice guys. No, they weren't, but that being said, they do lay the foundations for European society as we know it right now. Okay, so the so-called Middle Ages, they're also sometimes called medieval, and that's just a Latin term for middle age. I guess I'm in my medieval years. But nonetheless, we have a set of years there for you to understand just where we're talking. After 1500, we world historians call that the modern era. The ancient era is before 500, really, with the end of the Roman Empire. That ends the so-called ancient era. I don't know, can we think of a better name for the Middle Ages? I don't know. Anyway, so basically, who's going to take over for the Romans? Well, the Byzantines. They're a big-time player. Islam, which emerges by the 600s, and of course Christendom, the Christians, the Catholic Church, and Christian leaders. Can they take over? Basically, that is at the heart of the conflict and the question in the Middle Ages, especially once Islam comes into play by the 620s and 630s. And basically then what we start to see is Latin, as in the Romans, Christendom, begins to basically move north. We're moving out of the Mediterranean, where old Rome was, moving up into places that will be developed like Germany, England, Britain. It's not called Britain yet, and France. And of course Spain is going to be taken over, but just before that, even Spain. So Europe itself, Europe is actually pretty small, and if you had gone back in time to, I don't know, 700 CE and asked people or told people around the world, hey, you know what, that place there, Europe, Western Europe, they're going to basically control the planet by the 1800s, they would have laughed in your face. Of course, if you called it Europe, they wouldn't have understood you because they would have called it Christendom. Well, not them, but the Europeans. I digress. So basically, what is Europe? It basically runs from Portugal in the west over to the Ural Mountains, which are a good way into Russia. And Europe's impact on world history has been immense. I mean, Europe has really shaped the modern world today. But back in the day, during the Middle Ages, it was basically a frontier land. Basically, this place that's doesn't have a whole lot of people. It has the people it does have are existing clans that are often at war with each other. The Romans would have called them barbarians or barbaric tribes, like the Franks and the Angles and the Saxons and these peoples. And it was just this underdeveloped kind of backwater. No one thought anything of Europe being any semblance of any kind of power. That being said, Europe has some great soil for crops. That's even better than going south into the Mediterranean. So they have a lot of resources. It's got plenty of water access for transportation and for food, and a lot of rivers running through, like the Seine, the Danube, and some of these other critical Rhine and the Rhone rivers that are great for transportation, but also for development or creation of energy by turning water wheels. So there's a lot of potential in Europe at this time. Here you see medieval Europe, and we'll talk about a few of these places off and on throughout the year. You can see by the 900s, 1000s, the Byzantines have really shrunk, but we'll go back in time a little bit to talk about them in part 2 here when they were massive. You see the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. That's Napoleon's, not mine. We'll talk about them later on as well. Okay, so there we go. Okay, so basically who really brings Europe together? Well, there are some leaders who emerge in the 4 and 500s, and most of these are Germanic tribes. In other words, their languages are rooted in a Germanic dialect, and their cultures were quite a bit different from the Romans. These groups, a lot of them didn't really have laws. There were no real developed cities. The only cities were the ones that were left over, like Londinium or Paris or Barcelona, but all those places were built by the Romans. And by the time we get into the 500s, 600s, 700s, it's looking like a wasteland in some of those places as they're abandoned with the fall of Rome. So a lot of these communities and places, it's just small communities, and they they survive by custom as opposed to law, and even the customs aren't really written down. You would elect a king if you were if you were a Frank or Anglo or whatever, to lead in war. You would swear loyalty to the king and things like this, and you would fight for the king because he would make sure that he got you plenty of loot in the conflict. You're not directly paid by the king. Basically, you're just allowed to loot when the king invades and takes places over. But these Germanic tribes, they're the ones who are basically going to carve up Western Europe into other kingdoms, small kingdoms, but relatively speaking, the larger kingdoms than they were when they were just these barbaric tribes under the Romans. And the strongest of these groups were the Franks. And Frank, of course, will end up being the namesake for the country of France eventually. And one of the first to actually unite the Franks was a guy named Clovis. And there you can see his tomb up there on the right. And what Clovis does basically is he conquers what the Romans would have called Gaul. And Gaul today, of course, is France. And the other big thing that Clovis does is he converts to Christianity, which really was already widespread in Gaul because of Roman acceptance of Christianity all the way back at the end of the 300s. And what this does for Clovis, this isn't only a religious move for him, it's also, and probably more so, a political move, because this gains him an alliance with the Roman Catholic Church. Very, very powerful. And here's some video clippage that we'll check out briefly tomorrow, and it'll just show you what a nice guy Clovis was. No, he wasn't. Okay, so for these European groups, you can see over here in the map all these different groups: the Ostrogoths and the Lombards, the Thuringians, the Saxons, the Frisians, the Anglo-Saxons. Just for example, the Anglo-Saxons, Angles because of their axes that they like to carry as weapons with the sharp, angle. The Visigoths you see down there in the southwest. And don't forget ever the Burgundians, all these different groups, right? But what really threatens them from the outside is, by the 620s and 630s, Islam. And Islam becomes this threat to these peoples who are increasingly converting over to Christianity. And of course, Islam is going to spread all the way into Spain and takes over some of these, other Christian lands, and then looking all the way over to the Middle East, taking over the Holy Land there. So it's actually this outside threat that actually contributes to uniting some of these European groups, some of these barbarian groups, for lack of a better term, as they would have been called by the Romans. But one of the biggest turning points really in world history happens in the year 732, Apiers. That is a year that you just download into your brain. 732, Battle of Tours. Tours you can see over there in northwestern France. And this is where actually Charles Martel and the Franks defeated invading Muslim forces and basically halted the spread of Islam into Europe. And just think about that for a second. If the Battle of Tours goes the other way in 732 and Islam is victorious, we would be in a much, much different world. So yeah, the Battle of Tours is a key turning point, and there you see good old Charles Martel's tomb down there. Basically, the hero who saves Europe from Islam. And obviously, after the Battle of Tours and seeing Islam spread, Christians view Islam as a true threat, so it becomes this enemy. That being said, because of interactions with Islam, and remember, Muslims are spread all the way over to the Middle East and have much trade with the Indian Ocean and India, things like this, the Europeans are going to gain a lot of technology coming out from the East. And speaking of Islam, I mean, you can see all of the caliphates here essentially surrounding Europe. So you can only imagine living back then in the 700s, just how much of a threat, if you were politically astute, like a leader of some sort, you would definitely see Islam as a major, major threat. So the grandson of Charles Martel is going to build one heck of an empire, and he's actually considered the father of Europe. And he is Charles the Great, or who we often refer to as Charlemagne. And Charlemagne was a big dude. He was over 6 feet tall. Some people say he was as tall as 6'4". We don't know today. Definitely taller than Napoleon, but don't tell him. But nonetheless, this was a big guy. Back then, average height, you would have been 5'5", 5'6" as a male. So a guy that's over 6 feet tall back then is a big dude. And he is going to come to be known, at least historically speaking, in retrospect, the father of Europe. And for, nearly 50 years, he's fighting against Islam. He's fighting against various tribal groups, clans, north, south, and east. But what he is going to do is really unite much of what was the Western Roman Empire in Europe. And as a matter of fact, he becomes very close with the Pope, Pope Leo. And actually, it's going to be the Pope on Christmas Day in the year 800 who is actually going to crown Charlemagne as not only the Emperor of the Romans, but basically the defender of Christianity. But this is also a power play, right? Because if Charlemagne were to put the crown on his own head, that would say that he has the power. But if the Pope puts the crown on Charlemagne's head, that's the Pope saying, yeah, you're the defender of Christianity, but you answer to me. This is going to be quite a bit different when Napoleon asked for this same type of thing from the Pope. Anyway, so yeah, very significant ceremony for a Christian Pope to crown a German king as the Roman successor. Yeah, and really brought about this idea, or maybe even revived the idea of Christianity being united across Western Europe. But it's also going to be problematic, right? You're going to have the Roman Catholic popes at odds with German emperors, kings, and basically this conflict between who has more power, the Catholic Church or the emperors, the kings. And the Byzantines, they're not going to be too happy about this at all, because Byzantium, over there in the east where modern-day Turkey is, Constantinople, they view themselves as the protectors and defenders of Christianity. And this is going to really lay the foundations for what we called the Great Schism. Now, of course, the schism has all other kinds of causes as well, which we'll talk about. But this split begins really with the crowning of Charlemagne as the defender, because the Byzantines see themselves as the rightful heirs and defenders of Christianity. And basically, this is causing a broader split between the East and the West until by 1054, there'll be something called the Great Schism, where we'll see the Byzantines and later on places like Russia and Greece adopt Eastern Orthodoxy, whereas the West, Rome, France, these places will turn to Catholicism or Christianity. So what does Charlemagne do? His goal is to unite Europe and make sure that it is a Christian united Europe. And he would send out missionaries to try to convert folk, like the Slavic peoples, the Saxons, and these other, quote unquote barbaric groups or tribes. And those who didn't convert, well, he sent out his armies and sadly massacred these people. Charlemagne, ordered the executions of numerous peoples and groups of peoples who refused to convert. He also made alliances with the nobles. Nobles were essentially the folk who had very close allegiance to the king. They were willing to fight for the king. They then were assigned lands by the king, Charlemagne in this case. And ideally they would oversee these lands. They would make sure that taxes are being collected, this type of thing. Now, of course, they're not directly in charge of that. Charlemagne will have his own officials even directly for that who roam the lands, known as the Missi Dominici. But nonetheless, the nobles, it's important to talk about them because the nobles are going to gain a certain status in Europe, in places later on like England, but at this time in France and what is today Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands. And they're going to hold a lot of power because of their alliance with the king. And the other thing too is Charlemagne brings back the learning. They're going to open up some schools. They're going to make sure people can read. But nonetheless, this, of course, is only going to be for the elites. Cletus Jr. is not out, reading books and things like this as a peasant. As a matter of fact, to receive the gospel, to go to church, you would sit in the pews and probably not understand a thing that the priest or church official is saying because it's all in Latin. And you could very well not even understand it, but you do know that you need to be at the church at the time. Moreover, this is also educating clergy. And you also, you need officials to be able to write so that they can maintain records and maintain tax records and, know what's going on in the world. Hey, are we going to be invaded tomorrow? I don't know. Let's ask this guy because he knows how to read. Nonetheless, they do found a school at Aachen, and it's going to be directed by a particular official. It's neither here nor there. The point being, though, is that they create curriculum. They create a system of learning that teaches grammar and rhetoric, math and science, music, all these things, so that you are creating an educated populace. Like I said, though, an educated elite populace like the nobles and their kids, but nonetheless, spreading intelligence. And of course, scholars are hired to maintain track of history and what's going on, to copy down copies of the Bible. Remember, there's no printing press yet. So to copy things, you would basically just sit down and handwrite copy books. And, basically this whole idea of Charlemagne's educational system, it really becomes the foundation for European hegemonication. So what is the legacy of this guy? Well, basically we have this blending of the Germanic tribes coming together under Christianity, but also maintaining Roman culture with Latin, for example, and this idea of learning in schools. Set up a very strong and efficient government. The problem, though, for Charlemagne is that he dies, and when he dies, his empire falls apart. He has a few sons, and his sons, of course, they all want power, and basically they go to war for the next 30 years or so, until finally they agree to a treaty. His grandsons actually later on agree to a treaty, the Treaty of Verdun, where basically they split up his empire into 3 parts. And there you can see the Treaty of Verdun. So basically, this lays the foundation for some of the countries that will form much later, but nonetheless, places like France and Germany especially. But Europe is also under invasion and under siege during this time. And as we roll into the 800s, some interesting folk come from up north. But you also have people coming from the south too. Remember, you have Islam coming in from the south, also even coming in from the east, with only the Byzantines holding them off, a very weakened Byzantine empire by the 900s, 1000s. But from the north, you get these interesting folk called the Vikings. And I am sorry to say they didn't wear horned helmets, but nonetheless, they become a major threat. And these migrations coming in, and basically the Vikings, I mean, they're just ruthless. They invade into towns. They usually come in by water because they're excellent seafarers, and they just massacre folk and obliterate places. The thing about the Vikings, though, is that they don't leave. When they come into these places like Ireland, like England, in Northern Europe, they tended to just stay there, which basically means that, yeah, I mean, the Irish, the English to an extent, are Vikings. You know, they have Viking heritage coming down from the north up there, Scandinavia. So yeah, the Vikings burst out of Scandinavia, which, collectively places like Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, they wouldn't have called it that then, but nonetheless, they were very amazing seafarers. Just like 1,000 years before them, the Phoenicians, the Vikings were, perhaps even better, and they were able to, I mean, look, the Vikings crossed the Atlantic, really. I mean, they're one of the first ones to do so that we're aware of. They get, up into Iceland, Greenland, all the way over into what is today northeastern Canada. So these guys are expert seafarers, and this is, 500 years before Christopher Columbus. The problem is that when the Vikings do this, there's not a whole lot of learning, and even more so, there's no printing press, so the word of this is not really spread. And obviously Europe has a lot of other issues going on. But the Vikings, they're going to settle England, they're going to settle Ireland, northern France, parts of Russia. That's where the term Russia comes from, the Rus, which means those who row, and that's what the people there called these people coming in rowing, and those people rowing were Vikings. And even in 1000, you get Leif Erikson, who actually set up Viking colony in present-day Greenland. So the Vikings are these amazing seafarers, using the picture that you see there of the longship, these longships, which were very sturdy seafaring vessels. Viking culture is rather interesting, and we'll check out some good video clippage on this. They believed in the afterlife, but the place for them was Valhalla. And basically they would go there after death, where they could reside in, or at least visit, I guess, or be held in esteem with the king of the gods, Odin, in his great palace. And Valhalla basically has this kind of warrior ethos to it, with battle shields and golden roofs and walls and all this type of stuff. And the Vikings believed, if they died heroically in battle, that, after they died, that they would spend eternity, fighting and feasting with Odin. And Viking heroes, I mean, they were given a rather interesting funeral, which we will see in the video clippage as well. And, they had to be insured of their journey in the afterlife. So, they would be often buried with, sometimes their entire ship, but certainly with their weapons and their clothing. If you're a Viking leader, well, you need some help on this journey, so you would also kill all the servants, and they would also be buried with you for the trip to Valhalla. And there were other times too when the Vikings would set the ship on fire and set it adrift and watch it burn out at sea, just based on various Viking beliefs. Okay, so that finishes up part 1, and we'll get rolling on part 2 soon. But for right now, I'm going to sign out, and we'll see you on the flip side, denizens. Adios.